I would like to say I was surprised when my son secretly pushed me into a nursing home, but I was not. Instead, I was entirely ready. For years, I quietly watched him measure my worth by the slowing of my steps, unaware of the red folder hidden inside my desk. Welcome to the channel where we explore the dark realities of family betrayal and cold, calculated revenge. If you love hearing true stories about the underestimated taking absolute control, you are in exactly the right place. The story does not begin with a sudden eviction or a dramatic shouting match. It begins on a crisp Tuesday morning in an upscale neighborhood in Connecticut, where the lawns are manicured with mathematical precision and the driveways are paved with imported stone. That is where my son, Richard, lives. Or rather, that is where he performs the exhausting daily play of being a highly successful man. I paid for his college tuition, his master's degree, and the down payment on his first modest home, bleeding my own savings dry, so he could step into the corporate world without the heavy anchor of debt around his neck. He took that absolute financial freedom and used it to build a hollow monument to his own fragile ego. Whenever I visited, I did not see a son happy to welcome his father. I saw a man deeply inconvenienced by a ghost from his past. Richard had cultivated a lifestyle that required constant, aggressive financial maintenance. He drove a slate-gray Porsche 911. He made sure the emblem caught the sun just right when it was parked outside his exclusive country club. What he never mentioned, and what I knew because I am the very man who taught him how to read a ledger, was that the car was a lease. He was barely floating on 36-month terms. His entire existence was highly leveraged. He was swimming in high-interest debt, masking it with custom-tailored Italian suits and a vocabulary full of empty corporate buzzwords. He liked to use terms like strategic leveraging, equity maximization, and asset liquidity at the dinner table, looking past me as if I were a piece of antique furniture that had simply outlived its usefulness. His greetings were a masterclass in polite dismissal. When he answered the door, he would offer me a handshake. It was not the warm embrace of a child greeting his parent. It was the firm, measured grip of a mid-level executive trying to establish dominance in a boardroom negotiation. 2 quick pumps, aggressive eye contact that lasted exactly 1.5 seconds, followed immediately by a smile that never quite reached his eyes. It was a perfectly engineered smile meant for networking events, not for family. He would usher me into the grand foyer, immediately checking his expensive watch, subtly communicating that my presence in his house was running on a tight meter. I spent years sitting in his aggressively modern living room, drinking overpriced coffee that tasted like burnt earth, listening to him patiently explain the modern world to me. He spoke slowly, the way one might speak to a confused tourist or a lost child. He assumed that because I wore thick cardigan sweaters and still read a physical newspaper over breakfast, my understanding of the world had completely stopped in the late 90s. He viewed my frugality not as the very reason he had a safety net to tap into for his reckless real estate ventures, but as a severe character flaw, a sign of a small, uninspired mind. He thought my quietness was an early symptom of mental decline. I sat back and watched him operate. I watched the way he treated the local landscapers, snapping his fingers to get their attention as if they were dogs. I watched the way he spoke to his wife, delivering a series of passive-aggressive directives disguised as casual conversation. And most importantly, I watched the hungry way he looked at my modest, completely paid-off estate back in Pennsylvania. It was not a childhood home to him anymore. It was an unoptimized, undeveloped asset. It was trapped capital currently sitting in the hands of an aging man who was simply taking too long to expire. For a very long time, I swallowed the blatant disrespect. You make countless excuses for your children. You tell yourself that this is just the blinding ambition of youth, that the corporate world demands a certain ruthless edge, and that eventually, the boy you raised will find his way back through the thicket of his own staggering arrogance. You swallow your pride down to the absolute soles of your shoes, because the alternative is admitting that you engineered your own heartbreak. I sat on his imported leather sofa, nodding quietly, as he lectured me about the glaring inefficiencies of my retirement portfolio. I let him play the wealthy titan of industry. I let him believe he was the smartest man in any room he confidently walked into. He looked at my silence and saw weakness. He looked at my age and saw a heavy liability. He always thought I was an obsolete old man who knew absolutely nothing about the ruthless mechanics of modern finance. That was his first mistake. And it was also his most expensive one. It happened on a Thursday in late October. Richard and his wife had gone to Aspen for a long, lavish weekend, leaving me with a spare key to check on their golden retriever and water the imported orchids. I was standing in his home office, a room meticulously designed to look like it belonged to a Fortune 500 CEO rather than a mid-level regional manager. I was just looking for the security system manual, because the alarm panel kept chirping a low battery warning. I opened the bottom drawer of his heavy, imposing mahogany desk. I never found the security manual. What I found instead was a thick, glossy manila folder tucked carefully beneath a stack of boldly stamped, unpaid contractor invoices. The cover of the folder featured a beautifully lit stock image of a silver-haired couple laughing on a pristine golf course. The bold, embossed lettering across the top read, Sunset Meadows Premium Assisted Living and Memory Care. My memory, for the record, was perfectly fine. But looking at that glossy brochure, the blood in my veins ran absolutely cold. It was not just a colorful pamphlet designed to sell the illusion of a peaceful twilight. Tucked inside the centerfold was a crisp, neatly printed legal document, a durable power of attorney. It was already completely filled out. It granted Richard total, uncontested authority over my medical decisions, my bank accounts, and, most importantly, the absolute right to transfer the deed to my estate in Pennsylvania. All it needed was my signature, or, failing that, a doctor's signature declaring me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. I stood there and stared at the paperwork for a very long time. Most fathers would have felt a profound, crushing sense of heartbreak. They would have immediately called their son, demanding an explanation, screaming through the phone, shedding bitter tears over the ultimate betrayal of their own flesh and blood. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness completely evaporated the moment my eyes scanned the specific clause detailing the immediate liquidation of physical assets. Sadness is a useless emotion in a boardroom, and I suddenly realized that this was not a family anymore. This was a hostile takeover. Richard was not looking at me as a father. He was looking at me as a temporary obstacle standing between him and a multi-million-dollar payout required to save his drowning lifestyle. I held the damning paperwork in my trembling hands. I almost put it back. Almost. I do not know what made me pull my phone out of my pocket instead. Maybe it was the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the document. Maybe it was something much older and far colder than anger. I carefully smoothed the pages flat against the polished mahogany wood and took high-resolution photographs of every single page, making sure the lighting caught every damning syllable. Then, I placed the folder exactly where I found it, down to the absolute millimeter, ensuring the unpaid invoices rested on top just as they had before. If you are going to trap a rat, you cannot let him smell your scent on the cheese. I walked out of the office, locked the door behind me, and sat on his aggressively expensive leather sofa in the living room. The house was completely silent, save for the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock Richard had bought at an estate auction to make himself look like old money. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in 11 years. It belonged to Arthur Vance, a ruthless corporate attorney who used to swim in much deeper, much darker financial waters than Richard could ever possibly imagine. Arthur picked up on the third ring. I did not say hello. I did not ask how his wife was doing. I just asked him 2 questions. Are you still practicing? I asked. He paused, then said yes. Good, I replied. How fast can we set up a blind trust and acquire distressed debt? He gave me his answers. I hung up the phone. I looked around the pristine, heavily mortgaged living room of a boy who truly thought he had outsmarted the very man who taught him how to count. He wanted to play a ruthless game of asset relocation. He wanted to strip me down to nothing and lock me away in a room smelling of bleach and boiled vegetables just so he could keep his leased Porsche. He thought he was holding all the winning cards. He just did not know I owned the table. Richard's entire existence was a carefully constructed house of cards, built entirely on the fragile foundation of adjustable-rate mortgages and borrowed time. He loved to use the term asset liquidity when trying to impress his dinner guests, pouring expensive wine he had not actually paid for. But what Richard called liquidity, the federal banking system simply called a massive, defaulting liability. I knew this because I had Arthur quietly pull the public financial records on his Connecticut property. The reality was staggering. Richard had not just taken out a primary mortgage. He had leveraged a home equity line of credit to float his wife's lavish Aspen vacations, and then quietly secured a second mortgage to cover the brutal losses from a tech startup he had angel invested in blindly. He was 90 days behind on his primary payments. The bank was already preparing the preliminary paperwork for a pre-foreclosure. He was drowning, and his brilliant, ruthless solution was to steal my life jacket to keep himself afloat. If I had simply confronted him with the nursing home brochure, he would have denied it. He would have spun a complex web of corporate jargon, claiming he was just looking into future options, just being a highly responsible son planning for the inevitable. He would have gaslit me, manipulated his wife into playing the concerned daughter-in-law, and quietly found a much more secretive way to steal my estate. Confrontation is a rookie's game. It gives your opponent the immediate opportunity to change their strategy. I did not want to give Richard a chance to pivot. I wanted to completely remove him from the board. Arthur Vance did not waste a single hour. When you pay a corporate attorney of Arthur's caliber, you are not paying for legal advice. You are paying for velocity and silence. Within 48 hours, we established a blind trust, nested securely inside a newly minted shell company registered in Delaware. We named it Ironwood Asset Management. It was a perfectly boring, invisible name. It was the exact kind of mundane corporate title that gets immediately lost in a towering stack of final notices. Once Ironwood was fully capitalized using a significant portion of my own liquid retirement funds, Arthur reached out directly to the commercial lending division of Richard's bank. When Ironwood approached the asset management division, we presented ourselves as a predatory investment firm looking to acquire high-yield distressed properties in the Northeast. We spoke their language. We offered to assume all legal liabilities and future eviction costs. Commercial banks absolutely despise the foreclosure process. It is messy, it is aggressively public, and it ties up their capital in dead equity. The bank executives practically tripped over their own imported shoes to sign the title transfer and execute the assignment of mortgage. In less than 2 weeks, the paperwork was quietly finalized in a sterile boardroom 3 states away. It is a truly beautiful and terrifying thing, the fine print of a standard lending agreement. It is the invisible architecture that holds up the entire modern world. When you acquire a defaulted mortgage portfolio, you do not just buy the right to politely ask for the missing monthly payments. You buy the absolute, uncontested right to accelerate the loan. You buy the immediate legal authority to demand the full, outstanding balance of the property the moment the contract is materially breached. Richard had been in continuous, undeniable breach for 3 consecutive months. By the strict definition of the law, the deed to his meticulously manicured, stone-paved sanctuary was no longer held by a faceless national bank. It was held by Ironwood. It was held by me. He had absolutely no idea. To Richard, nothing in his daily life had changed. The only minor difference was a slightly different corporate logo printed on the aggressive warning letters that arrived in his mailbox, which he immediately shoved into the bottom drawer of his desk, right next to the nursing home brochures. He was far too busy researching the most restrictive, legally binding ways to declare me mentally incompetent to notice that the financial ground beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes had completely evaporated. I sat in his living room the following weekend, sipping my mediocre coffee, watching him confidently pace across the hardwood floors. He was loudly talking on his cell phone to a real estate broker in Pennsylvania, casually discussing the estimated market value of my home, laughing about how quickly he could flip the property once the current tenant was relocated. He looked at me, gave me a patronizing wink, and mouthed the words, "just business." I smiled back at him, a genuine, warm smile. He thought he was taking my roof. He did not know that I had already owned his foundation from 3 months ago. It happened on the second Sunday of November. Richard drove all the way out to my home in Pennsylvania, entirely unannounced. He did not just walk through the front door. He practically burst through it, carrying a bottle of mid-tier Merlot, and wearing a smile so wide and aggressively cheerful it looked like it physically hurt his jaw. He found me in the kitchen, carefully measuring out coffee grounds. He slapped me on the shoulder with a booming laugh that echoed off the linoleum. It was the absolute performance of a lifetime. "Dad," he announced, pouring 2 glasses of wine a full hour before noon. "You look exhausted. You have been cooped up in this old house for way too long. Sarah and I were talking, and we decided it is time you had a real, proper break." He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a glossy envelope, slapping it triumphantly onto the kitchen island. He pitched it as a 4-week, all-inclusive stay at a premier senior wellness retreat in Boca Raton, Florida. He called it a luxury vacation. He enthusiastically painted a vivid picture of endless golf courses, warm ocean breezes, catered meals, and a dedicated medical staff there simply to keep my joints feeling young. He spoke with the rapid, breathless cadence of a timeshare salesman trying to close his monthly quota. I looked down at the envelope. Then I looked up at my son. His right leg was bouncing nervously under the counter. He was speaking entirely too fast, filling every single second of silence with loud, manufactured excitement. He was a man desperately trying to close a fraudulent deal before the mark could read the fine print. I knew exactly what this was. This was not a vacation. This was a tactical extraction. He needed me physically out of the state for a month. He needed me geographically isolated, tucked away in a facility that provided a convenient paper trail of me requiring medical supervision. That was the missing piece he needed to officially trigger the power of attorney. He planned to list this very house on the market, empty it of my belongings, and liquidate my entire life before I even unpacked my sunscreen. Most fathers would have snapped. They would have thrown the wine in his face and demanded he leave the property. But confrontation is loud, and I required absolute silence. I simply picked up my glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and let my hands tremble, just a fraction of an inch. It is remarkably easy to play a fool when your opponent desperately needs you to be one. I let my shoulders sag forward. I looked at the glossy envelope with a perfectly calibrated expression of mild, senile confusion. "Florida?" I asked, keeping my voice faint and slightly reedy. "But who will water the tomatoes in the greenhouse, Richard?" He let out an exasperated fond chuckle. It was the exact patronizing laugh you give to a toddler who does not understand adult logistics. "Do not worry about the house, Dad. I will take care of absolutely everything here. You just focus on relaxing and getting your strength back." He practically sprinted up the wooden stairs to help me pack. For the next 2 hours, my quiet home was filled with the frantic, booming energy of a man rapidly securing his own financial salvation. He folded my sweaters with manic, aggressive efficiency. He loudly narrated how much fun I was going to have, how good the Florida sun would feel on my back, and how I deserved to finally rest. I sat on the edge of my bed, completely quiet and perfectly obedient. I watched him meticulously pack away my life into a canvas bag. I let him play the dutiful, loving son. I let him feel the intoxicating, dizzying rush of getting away with the perfect crime. I did not offer a single word of resistance. I let him believe his manipulation was flawless. When we finally walked out to the driveway, the crisp autumn air hit us both. I reached into my pocket and handed him the heavy brass keys to the front door. His fingers snatched them with the desperate speed of a pickpocket. He tossed my luggage into the trunk of his leased Porsche and turned back to face me. He carried my suitcase with the brightest, most genuine smile he had worn in 10 years. I smiled too. We were both looking forward to this trip, just in very different ways. Sunset Meadows did not look like a prison. It was painted in soothing shades of mint green and beige, designed specifically to make the families feel completely absolved of guilt as they drove away. But the moment the automatic sliding glass doors hissed shut behind Richard, the carefully constructed illusion vanished. The air inside always smelled faintly of industrial bleach, boiled cabbage, and stale linen. It was a clinical, desperate attempt to mask the undeniable scent of waiting. They served coffee in small styrofoam cups at exactly 8 in the morning. It tasted like warm brown water and quiet resignation. The nurses were perfectly polite, armed with laminated, high-wattage smiles and a patronizing tone of voice usually reserved for pacifying frightened toddlers. They called me Sweetie. They asked me if I needed assistance finding the television room to watch the morning game shows. I smiled back at them, nodding slowly, shuffling my feet just a fraction of an inch to sell the performance. I spent my mornings sitting in a high-backed vinyl chair by the oversized observation window, watching the groundskeepers meticulously rake leaves that would only fall again tomorrow. The facility had structured activities designed to quietly eat the hours. Water aerobics at 10. Group bingo at 2. It was a place engineered to make you forget the outside world entirely. But my mind had never been sharper. I was not a prisoner trapped in a pastel waiting room. I was a sniper settling silently into a blind. controlling my breathing, waiting for the target to walk directly into the crosshairs. While I sat drinking terrible coffee in Florida, Richard was moving with the frantic, reckless speed of a man who believes he has just pulled off the perfect heist. I knew his exact schedule without even having to ask. He had officially listed my house in Pennsylvania on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he had already fired my longtime gardener and hired a staging company to replace my antique furniture with soulless, modern rental pieces to maximize the property's curb appeal. He was fielding aggressive cash offers from developers. He was eagerly signing preliminary paperwork, using the durable power of attorney he had successfully triggered the moment the resident doctor at Sunset Meadows, aggressively prodded by Richard's persistent phone calls, documented my need for extended cognitive observation. He was likely celebrating with his wife, pouring expensive wine, talking loudly about the immediate liquidity my estate was going to inject into their failing portfolio. He confused my absolute stillness with complete surrender. That is the ultimate danger of arrogance. It makes you entirely deaf to the sound of the ice cracking beneath your own expensive shoes. I did not call him. I did not ask a single question about my house. I simply sat by the window and mentally ticked the days off the calendar. The waiting is always the hardest, most agonizing part of any calculated demolition. You have to let the structure completely hollow itself out before you push the plunger. You have to let the mark commit so deeply to the lie that they have absolutely no possible avenue of retreat. Day 3. I watched a resident try to sneak out through the delivery courtyard. Day 7. Richard officially accepted a buyer's cash offer on my estate. Day 12. The initial grace period for Ironwood Asset Management's foreclosure notice on Richard's Connecticut mansion quietly and permanently expired. The air in the facility suddenly felt incredibly thick. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of anticipation. The trap was fully set, the steel spring pulled back to its absolute maximum tension. I stopped shuffling my feet. I stopped smiling at the nurses. I sat alone in my room, staring at the generic artwork on the wall, listening to the heavy, methodical ticking of my watch. The rhythm of the story was shifting. The slow crawl of the setup was entirely over. On the 14th day, my phone rang. It was not him calling. It was my lawyer. It was time. It happened at exactly 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon. Richard was standing in the glass-walled conference room of his firm, pitching a series of leveraged buyouts to a table full of senior partners, projecting the absolute image of an untouchable financial prodigy. That was the exact moment a remarkably unbothered process server in a windbreaker bypassed the front desk, walked directly up to the glass doors, and handed Richard a thick, legally bound envelope. It was not a gentle reminder. It was a formal, non-negotiable notice to vacate. Ironwood Asset Management was no longer just a shadow on his credit report. They were legally repossessing the Connecticut property, effective immediately. I did not have to be there to know exactly how he reacted. Arthur's courier described it perfectly. The color completely drained from his face, leaving the pale, sickly complexion of a man who just realized he was swimming in a pool with no bottom. He excused himself, his voice cracking, the illusion of the dominant corporate titan instantly shattering in front of his entire executive board. He sprinted to his leased Porsche. He broke at least 4 traffic laws, driving back to his exclusive suburb, his mind racing with frantic strategies to outmaneuver the faceless corporate entity that had purchased his debt and called the final loan. He burst through the heavy mahogany front doors of his mansion, screaming for his wife, aggressively dialing his real estate attorney on speakerphone. He stormed into the living room, ready to declare war. He stopped dead in his tracks. The phone slipped from his trembling hand and hit the imported hardwood floor with a sharp, heavy crack. I was not in a mint-green room in Boca Raton, Florida. I was sitting perfectly still on his aggressively modern leather sofa. I was drinking Earl Grey tea from his wife's fine china. I was wearing the exact same thick cardigan sweater he always despised. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice trembling, his brain violently rejecting the visual information it was processing. "What are you doing here? How did you get out? You were supposed to be under medical supervision." I did not smile. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the leather briefcase resting by my feet, pulled out a single sheet of watermarked paper, and slid it smoothly across the glass coffee table. It was the finalized deed of trust. Richard stared at it. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at the paper. His eyes frantically scanned the bold lettering. He saw his defaulted mortgage details. He saw the transfer of absolute liability. And at the bottom, he saw the authorized signatory for Ironwood Asset Management. It was my signature. The same signature he had been desperately trying to forge on a fraudulent medical directive just a week prior. The silence in the room was absolute. You could practically hear the gears in his head grinding, violently stripping themselves as the horrifying reality of his situation finally locked into place. He had not outsmarted an old senile man. He had casually walked into a financial guillotine, and the old man was the one holding the rope. "You," he gasped, his face flushing with a sudden violent shade of crimson. "You bought my debt. You set up a shell company to steal my house?" "I did not steal anything, Richard," I replied, my voice as flat and cold as a frozen lake. "You defaulted. You over-leveraged a lifestyle you could not afford. And you tried to liquidate my entire existence to cover your own careless margins. You tried to throw me away like a broken appliance. I simply made a highly strategic real estate investment. It is just business." He lost his mind. The polished, polite executive completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, frantic animal. He screamed. He waved his arms. He threatened to call the police, to sue me, to enforce the power of attorney. He shouted that he was my flesh and blood, that I was a monster, that I was ruining his life. I let him scream. I let him completely exhaust himself, watching his tailored suit wrinkle and sweat stain his expensive collar. When he finally ran out of breath, left panting and shaking in the center of the room, I placed my teacup down on the saucer with a quiet, definitive click. "Your power of attorney was nullified by my legal counsel the moment you boarded your flight to Aspen last month," I stated clearly, cutting through his panic like a surgical blade. I stood up, adjusting my cardigan, looking at the boy who tried to bury me alive. "Today is Thursday. You have 48 hours to vacate my property." Richard did not pack his belongings in 48 hours. He spent the first 24 frantically calling every single corporate attorney in the tri-state area, desperately begging for a last-minute legal injunction that was never going to materialize. By Friday evening, the horrifying reality had finally and completely broken through his staggering arrogance. I sat quietly on the front porch and watched the moving trucks arrive. I watched his wife sobbing silently in the paved driveway, wiping her eyes with an expensive silk scarf. I watched the repo men arrive exactly 3 days later to hook up his beloved slate gray leased Porsche, the very same car he used to mock my perfectly fine, quiet existence. It turns out, when your personal financial structure collapses so violently and so publicly, the luxury auto leasing companies are always the very first ones to come collecting. The professional fallout at his corporate firm was absolute and immediate. You cannot confidently sell complex leveraged buyouts to billionaires when you have just been publicly evicted and completely outmaneuvered by a faceless shell company in a hostile takeover of your own primary residence. He was quietly let go by the end of the month. He had desperately wanted to put me in a pastel-painted room smelling of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage so he could steal my foundation. Now, he is the one living in a cramped, soulless two-bedroom apartment, entirely drowning in a vast sea of bad credit, outstanding legal fees, and utterly shattered pride. I did not stay in his Connecticut mansion. I immediately liquidated the massive property, added the substantial remaining equity to my own liquid retirement portfolio, and drove back to my quiet, completely paid-off estate in Pennsylvania. I immediately fired the corporate staging company, brought my heavy antique furniture out of storage, and started watering the tomatoes in the greenhouse again. The house is completely peaceful now. The only sound is the grandfather clock gently ticking in the hallway. There is a profound, unavoidable rhythm to the universe. Some men spend their entire lives building hollow, leveraged kingdoms, calculating ruthless ways to steal from the very people who built them up, only to lose absolutely everything on a Thursday afternoon, simply because they critically underestimated an obsolete old man in a thick cardigan sweater. He thought he was playing a brilliant, untouchable game of chess. He just did not realize he was already in checkmate. If you truly liked hearing this dark story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing to the official channel for many more true stories of the underestimated taking absolute control.